Good evening, good afternoon. We will first have something which is just to set your focus on a screen.
Thinking of good governance as a national or regional practice is thinking in the dimensions of yesterday. Practicing good governance globally is without alternative today. But what does it mean? What does it require? What are the institutions? What are their rules? Welcome to the panel, Fixing Global Governance, the Summit of the Future.
Good afternoon. The panel is panel 3, Fixing Global Governance. How we're going to fix the global governance, it will be seen in September this year on the Summit of the Future. That is going to be happening under the umbrella of General Assembly of the United Nations, under the leadership of Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And we have in here with us Guy Ryder, Under Secretary General for Policy at the United Nations, but basically speaking, he is here because he runs Summit of the Future. So it's actually the guy who is at this moment in this planet in charge of trying to see what the future is going to be looking like. I have in here, besides all those panelists who are extremely distinguished group of people, there is also one small group of people who we, as a Global Baku Forum, are having for years, last years. This is the 11th Global Baku Forum, but some years ago, we put together the group of young leaders who were with us during the forum, and usually the last panel is actually, they talk from their perspective what they find out to be interesting. So why I'm warning Guy Ryder, my dear friend, that besides the smart people who will be saying the smart things that we all expected to be generated from here, and there are so many people who can talk even more eloquently than some of us in here, we have 20 young people who are chosen this year in the very competitive international screening process. They are coming from 5 continents, from 12 countries, who are here, and we agreed that on the last day they will actually produce their view of the Summit of the Future and of the COP29. So they were given the draft 0 of the declaration of the Summit of the Future. That is actually, here's Leonardo da Vinci that is putting his team to have that masterpiece that we get adopted in September. So our Leonardo is going to be followed by 20 young Leonardos who will be really carefully listening what we are saying, and they will produce, they will be like one of member country, Guy. Every member country is giving their opinion on what should be there. So they decided to be young leaders of Global Baku Forum 2024 as a member country. So they will participate all the way to September and be giving some inputs to you. If you don't want directly, we'll find some member country who will adopt them just temporarily. Okay, you are here someplace, people. Could you stand up? So, stand up. Round of applause for virtual member country. Okay, thank you so much. Now, here we are. We have Guy Ryder, who I said already, Jean-Claude Trichet, President of European Central Bank, the guy who invented what we're all using and made it stable. And a lot of us are actually still economically floating because we adopted it. Even us who don't have euro as our own currency, who have just central bank as a currency board like we did in Dayton. We have Maria Fernanda Espinosa, former president of United Nations General Assembly, Minister of Foreign Affairs and friend. Of course, great pleasure to have Mohammed Yunus, our dear friend, Nobel Peace Prize laureate from some years ago, and who is still fresh as the time before he got Nobel Peace Prize. We have Ruvendrini Menikdiwela. You have almost tough last name like I do. My last name is Zlatko Lagumdzija. If you pronounce my name properly, I'll pronounce your name properly as well. So she's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection and United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Csaba Korosi, another President of General Assembly, just until last year. And of course, we have dear friend Micheline Calmy-Rey, former President of Switzerland, the country that we envy so much, a lot of us in Western Balkan who want to be Switzerland of Western Balkan. And of course, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, President of Iceland, the man who there are no use to spare words because of his personality. He had a big footprint in multilateral arena as a president of Iceland. Now, Guy, bring us in the future.
Well, Zlatko, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to say something about this summit of the future. And I have to say, in the time I've been here in Baku, I've heard some very clear messages. Firstly, very widely held concern about the fractured state of our world and the dangers that implies, but equally considerable concern about what appears to be the collective incapacity of the international community to respond effectively. And when one, of course, speaks of the collective action of the international community, one immediately thinks of the United Nations. So if there was going to be a conclusion adopted by this forum, and I understand that's not the purpose of this forum, I would not be surprised if it were faced with this fractured world, why doesn't the United Nations do something about it? And in that perspective, the good news is that the United Nations is doing something about it. The Secretary General, as you've told us, Zlatko, has proposed, and his proposition has been accepted by the General Assembly, the convocation of a summit of the future, which will meet in September of this year, the objective of which is to better equip the multilateral system, the United Nations, to deliver on commitments already made. And you may think of the Charter of the United Nations, you may think of the 2030 Agenda, but also to better address the new and emerging issues which are coming at us thick and fast in this rapidly changing world. Now, in the limited time available, I want to take you through what is on the table, what will be on the table and is currently being negotiated for the Pact of the Future, which will be the outcome of the summit. But before I do that, because it's important to set a little bit of context to these debates, just a word about thinking, why we find ourselves in this situation of fracture and uncertainty, and let's be honest, questioning of the efficacy of the multilateral system. And I'm going to do this very, very telegraphically, simply to put some thoughts in the minds perhaps of our panelists and of all of you in the audience. Our current multilateral system is operating in a situation, and it's much commented upon, of a long-term political cycle which sees us, of course, having left the Cold War period, gone into a period of unipolar ascendancy, and now into a period of multipolarity, embedded in which, of course, is a very important superpower rivalry. And I think you have to factor in those circumstances into our current situation if we are fully to appreciate the challenges which multilateralism faces today, and therefore what we need to do to meet those challenges. So that long political cycle. And then we have a world, and we can discuss why it is the case, where people are strongly impacted and affected by growing inequalities, many of which they associate with the operation of the global economy and hence of the international system, this sense of injustice and unfairness in the manner in which the international system and the economic system in particular is operating. Linked to that, a world which is changing, transforming at an extraordinary pace, and people feel disoriented, people feel out of control, They think that they are not so much actors as recipients of the changes that are taking place in the world. And for some of these reasons, they look to the future more frequently with a feeling of foreboding than with a feeling of opportunity and optimism. And a consequence of all of this, I think, is that we are seeing around the world a rise in political sentiment and popular opinion of isolationism, nativism, which in individual behavior, I think, translates in terms of intolerance, a rejection of multiculturalism, but collectively translates into a, I'm going to be polite, loss of appetite for multilateralism. If the My Country First agenda translates into a zero-sum game where national interest is juxtaposed against effective multilateralism, we have a problem which might prove to be insoluble. And finally, we have a situation in which popular perception is that multilateralism has been incapable of delivering on essential elements of its well-established responsibilities. We can think of Gaza, we can think of Ukraine, we can think of climate change, we can think of a great deal else. This is the context. This is the circumstance in which the Summit of the Future will be meeting. And you could argue that whatever defects, whatever is holding us back in our current circumstances, has less to do with the defects of the multilateral system and the machinery at our disposal, and much more to do with the intentions and attitudes of member states. And if such is the case, I think we have to take it into account when we gather in New York in September. Nevertheless, when we had a preparatory meeting for the Summit of the Future of Ministers last September, there was very strong, I would say unanimous expressions of support not only for the summit, but for multilateralism as well, with the caveat that yes to multilateralism, but not the multilateralism that we have today. It needs to be significantly changed and reformed. We have to fix it. So, on that basis, the decision has been taken by the General Assembly that the summit should adopt a 5-chapter Pact of the Future. I'm going to take you through those 5 chapters in extremely telegraphic form. The first is a chapter on sustainable development and financing, a recognition that we continue to work to accelerate delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the halfway stage, we were on track for only 15% of them, and that a precondition for delivering on the SDGs is mobilizing the necessary finance to make those SDGs a reality. That's the first chapter. Secondly, unsurprisingly, international peace and security. The Secretary General has put to the summit a comprehensive new agenda for peace, which attempts to cover the whole, what he refers to as continuum of peace, from prevention to peace building, peacekeeping, peace enforcing, to exit from conflict and reconstruction. A new agenda which also intends to address the new and emerging domains of conflict and risks to security. Think of cyberspace, think about the advent of lethal autonomous weapons and the like. The third chapter is centered around technology, science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation. Here, put in a sentence, this is about making technology work for humanity, ensuring that the benefits of technology apply equitably, not only to the benefit of the few, and that technological advances are applied in a manner which not only is equitable, but protective of human rights and human freedoms. There is a great deal of attention today on the governance of artificial intelligence. This is expected to be one of the most controversial and difficult parts of the negotiations of the pact, but it should not be to the exclusion of the very many other issues which are at stake in this chapter. And by the way, this chapter will have annexed to it a global digital compact that will give form to the objectives that we are formulating. The fourth chapter, and Zlatko, you've been very, very strong in emphasizing the importance of engaging and responding to the needs of youth and future generations. The fourth chapter is on youth and future generations. The intention of the Secretary-General in respect of youth is to develop mechanisms whereby the participation of youth is not just increased, it's made more meaningful. It will have consequences. Young people don't simply want to be heard, they want the consequences of being heard to be felt in the decisions that are taken. So it's the meaningful nature of youth participation and its systematic application which is being targeted here, as well as the familiar social and economic challenges facing young people. Think jobs, think social protection, think education. The future generations piece is slightly different. This is not about today's young people. It's about the 10 billion people who will be born, not yet with us, but will be born before the end of this century, and how policy making today needs to take account of their rights and interests in what we do. And this will be formulated in the Declaration on Future Generations. Last, finally, transforming global governance. All of those pieces of the international architecture which originate in the world of 1945, Security Council being the most obvious point, and it's been discussed, but also the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and beyond the immediate confines of New York, the international financial architecture. The sentiment of the Secretary-General is that there is need for fundamental reform of the international financial architecture to render it more capable of serving the real economy, equitably serving the interests of developing and developed nations. This, too, is going to be a major point of contention and debate. I close, Zlatko, by saying what stage we are at. A zero draft of the pact has been formulated, not by me, but by our co-facilitators, the permanent representatives of Germany and Namibia. It's a 20-page document, but on first reading, it generated 242 pages of suggestions and amendments from member states. So we have a job of concision and focus, and I hope raising of ambition to accomplish in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Guy, for this excellent outline of where we are at and what we are planning to do. Without further notice, as Guy already said, I mean, of course, all panelists, whatever I tell them to ask them, they already have their lines what they want to talk about. But I will still just to some of them, because Professor Yunus told me, I mean, I want very simple question to ask him, how do you think we should fix the future? So that's what's the question I'm going to ask him, which he asked. But that, before that, because the first out of those 5 areas is actually the area that is dealing with sustainable development and financial sustainable development. So I won't ask you nothing, but I'm sure that we cannot skip that you tell us something about how we can fix the financial system of financing SDGs.
It is so easy, of course, Mr. Moderator. No problem. We will solve the problem in 2 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. I have to say that I heard what Guy said with great attention, and I will concentrate in these chapters or in the points. I will concentrate on the reform of the international financial architecture in this extremely bold and I would say important summit for the future that you are organizing. Let me say that I share totally the view that we are in an extremely dangerous situation from all standpoints. I never could see the world so hectic in all domains, and including in my own domain, economy and finance. I have to say that the fragility of the world seems to me higher than before any time I had observed it, including immediately before the crisis of Lehman Brothers. So the last great economic and financial crisis was capturing a world which, in my own reading, particularly, I have to say, in terms of indebtedness as a percentage of GDP, global GDP, GDP of many nations, it is more fragile today than it was at the time. So there is no time for complacency at all. We have to work very, very actively, not only because the world is extremely fragile, but also because we have a lack of consensus on global governance, and in that respect, of course, what Guy said is so important. So let me concentrate very rapidly on 5 points. I will start by the IMF. I take it that the IMF is absolutely key, and then there is something which is to be regretted, the very late adaptation of the quotas and the voting powers in the IMF in comparison with the dramatic changes of the world since World War II, as was again underlined by the previous speakers. So we fortunately went through the last review of quotas with an augmentation of 50%, which is not totally negligible. We have now $960 billion as regards the quotas. After this 50% augmentation, it's good, but it has to be implemented, and it will be difficult, we know by experience, to be implemented. There is a deadline. The deadline is November 15. We have, of course, a lot of, I would say, difficulties. The European and the US are too influential, there is no doubt on that, and they have to give room for other countries. We have to have also an accord on quota formula that should work and be workable in the long run, because the world will not cease to adapt and change very rapidly. We have a deadline in June 2025, but only for the international community to present all approaches to be good guide for the new formulas. So, as you see, even in this domain, where the catching up between the change of the world and the change of the governance of the IMF is so key, so important, we still have a lot of hard work to do, and it's a pity. World Bank, more or less the same. We have, at the level of the World Bank decision-making process, 43 countries that are clearly underrepresented, and 10 countries that are extreme outliers. And that has to be corrected. It's extremely important. And I could, of course, elaborate even much more on the World Bank, I would say, handling and governance. MDBs, multilateral development banks, a lot has to be done in this domain. We used to concentrate only on the Bretton Woods institutions, stricto sensu, the World Bank, the IMF, but the MDBs are absolutely essential all over the world, and they have to change also progressively their own franchise. They should shift from direct lending towards risk mitigation, aiming at mobilizing private capital much more, and of course, the idea that they should concentrate on mitigating risks and permitting, facilitating all other financing is of extreme importance. I think there is a consensus on that. It's easy to say, more difficult to perform. I would say that the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, and the Basel committees are extremely important themselves. As you know, they are reporting to the G20, and the G20, in my opinion, will work very well only if the IMF and the World Bank are reformed. Otherwise, this constituency of the main shareholders is divided, because main shareholders does not mean fair shareholding, and on top of that, you have all that are not members of the G20, of course, and are very anxious to be appropriately represented in the international financial institutions. So back to FSB, as I said already, we are in a world, in a financial sphere, in an economic sphere, which I considered not only as dangerous than it was before Lehman Brothers and the last big financial crisis, but even more dangerous. And on top of that, of course, we have all the tensions all over the world which are aggravating this situation. We had not got those tensions in 2007, 2008, when there was the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. So again, extreme attention should be concentrated on the financial sphere, and we should, I would say, strengthen the joint capacity to concentrate on preventing financial crisis. We should improve considerably the relationship between the FSB and the IMF in this respect. I take it that there is the emerging consensus on that, but emerging consensus is good, but it has to be performed, it has to be implemented. So, as you see, I see a lot of very hard work to do if we want to be up to the present challenges, and those challenges are listed in the list that Guy was mentioning. Each of them is extremely important, but I would say we are ourselves in a financial, economic, and monetary sphere connected with the rest of the points that you mentioned, and I would say in particular on the geostrategic aspect of it. Only if the international financial institutions are extremely rapidly reformed, and more rapidly than what we have in mind today, we might have extremely difficult crisis, and I'm not sure that in the future we will be lucky enough to manage the crisis as we did in the past. So as you see, I would conclude with the following in Latin, if you permit here. Serius est quam cogitas. It is later than you think, and it's good for all of us. Thank you.
You almost froze us all, and then you kind of reverted it optimistically. So, Maria Fernanda, I know that whatever I ask you, as I said, you will do your job, you will do what you were thinking, but I would like to have your thoughts about next chapter, practically, which is international peace and security. And this is, and Csaba, I want you to know that I'm going to ask you the same thing, right? Okay, good. So I warned you in advance. I expect also peace and security mechanism from you, because you guys are, you used to be president of a General Assembly, and I mean, if there's a parliament of the planet, that's what it is. So, Maria Fernanda, please.
You caught me off guard. But in any case, I think that I'm speechless after listening to an expert view on where we stand in terms of our macroeconomic situation and the capacity of multilateral financial institutions to respond to the current crisis. But I would like, if you allow me, Chair, to basically ask three questions here. The first question is, why do we need a summit of the future? We might say yet another summit. There is a summit fatigue, and the multilateral system is eroded with mistrust and divides and a culture of business as usual. Why is that we need yet another summit? And I will try to respond to that question, listening, of course, to the previous speakers. The second question is about process. Sometimes process is as important as content in a summit. And third, my third question would be, what is the content that we are expecting to come out of the summit? In terms of the first question, why in this environment of summit fatigue, we want to push for a summit of the future. And I would say, very quickly, headline mode, 4 reasons. Number one, because we are facing new challenges, different challenges than in 1945. And these new challenges have been mentioned over and over again this morning and this afternoon. The climate crisis, rampant inequalities, security and conflict, organized crime, migration, massive displacement. We will hear from our colleague from the Office of the High Commissioner on Refugees, in a profound crisis of the Anthropocene, a crisis of the war that we have declared on nature, and the capacity of humans to govern our environmental commons, among other issues, artificial intelligence, new technologies. So the situation, the challenges are different than what we had in 1945. The second reason is a profound change in the geopolitical landscape, how to navigate and how to respond with governance arrangements to a dramatically different geopolitical, power share globally. We are living, many of you have said that, a polycentric world, a multipolar world with a different distribution of power, with emerging powers and economies around the world that need and want and deserve a better share in the global governance, as we heard, in terms of the governance, for example, of the multilateral financial institutions. Number 3, because the institutional scaffold that we have today was designed almost 80 years ago and is not fit for purpose anymore, in terms of the gravitas of the system, in terms of the representation of the system, in terms of the huge, huge implementation deficit of decisions that are taken, for example, in the spaces of the United Nations. In terms of, for example, the way the United Nations are funded. Do you know that the entire budget of the UN is a little more than $3 billion to do everything and solve every single problem? So we need a structural response to better fund the system. Number 4, because we truly need a new compass. We need a sense of collective direction. We need a new contract for coexistence in a world that has dramatically changed. The second question here is on process. And believe me that I've been around in the multilateral scene for a long time, for about 30 years. And I have never seen, perhaps during the Rio +20 process that gave birth to the Sustainable Development Goals, but I have never seen such massive mobilization of society around the Summit of the Future. A coalition for the UN we need that has more than 800 organizations from around the world, universities, think tanks, the private sector, grassroots organizations, saying one thing: we want and we need and we deserve a better United Nations, an organization that is rejuvenated, that is able to deliver, that has more legitimacy, more traction, more gravitas. And basically, there is a process that has been taking place for more than 2 years of consultations, town halls, negotiations among member states, a process that, in my opinion, is as important as the end product, because it's creating, in spite of the divides, in spite of the sometimes animosity that we see, there is ownership, there is interest, there is traction. I don't think there is a coincidence to have a 0 draft of the Pact of the Future of 20 pages, and then now and today, after consultations, we have 242 pages. And some people are terrified because of these 242 pages of this new contract that we are all going to sign. I'm not afraid. I think that, things in multilateral negotiations, things get worse until they get better, and it really shows ownership from governments. But this issue is so important that we cannot leave all the weight and responsibility in the shoulders of governments and member states. This has to be a global mobilization, especially from the younger generations, saying what they imagine that the UN should be in the 21st century. So, and there are two processes, the formal intergovernmental negotiated Pact of the Future, that I'm sure is not going to have 242 pages, Guy, no, and also the People's Pact of the Future that is in the making. More than 200 pages, that People's Pact of the Future. So engagement, trust building, ownership is of essence in this process. The third question is about content. And what are the outcomes that we expect? Guy explained very well the 5 chapters that are going to be the structure, the scaffold of the Pact of the Future. And we know very well that summits do not solve the problems of the world. Declarations do not solve the problems of the world. But why is it that the outcomes are also as important as process? Why? Because I think that what we're going to have at the end of this process is a mandate, is a menu, is a setting of priorities, is a list of things to do for the near and midterm future. We are not going to reform the UN Security Council after the summit, but this is going to boost a process that is been ongoing for 20 years, is going to make a call for a better redistribution of power between the main organs of the United Nations, and here, of course, in a very biased way, to give more power to the most democratic organ of the system, which is the UN General Assembly, to reorganize and give a new mandate to the Trusteeship Council, for example, and to think about the main challenges of today's world is how to govern our environmental commons, the atmosphere, oceans, outer space, etc., etc. So, with that said, I would close only by saying that there is still time for us, not only governments, for us, citizens, societies, to decide if we want one more summit or we aim at shaping a roadmap for a truly renewed, rejuvenated, relevant multilateral system. And I think that we often speak about the multiple crises, the environmental crisis, the financial crisis, the security crisis. And I think that the challenge for us is to overcome what, in my opinion, is perhaps the deepest and most profound crisis, which is a crisis of imagination. The summit also calls, to revert the crisis of imagination. So, and we should not be afraid of complexity. Our world is complex, and we need to be able to have the categories to respond to the complexity. Redefine the issues that seem to be written in stone. For example, what is the meaning of national interest versus global interest? What is the meaning of sovereignty? What is the potential of shared sovereignty over, for example, the commons? And I think that there are two things that we cannot afford as we prepare for the Summit of the Future: indifference and pessimism. These are the two things that we cannot afford, because pessimism can lead to paralysis. I think it is time for a grounded, smart, imaginative optimism. So basically, as a citizen, as a former president of the UN General Assembly, as a woman from Latin America, what I would like to see is a common plan for a common and shared humanity and one shared planet, a healthy and accountable, a multilateral system that is based on ethics, on shared values. And we know that the UN, the United Nations, is not only the sum of its parts, of its member states. It's much more than that. We don't have a plan B for the UN, and I think it is our time. It is our collective responsibility. And the good news is that the future doesn't start tomorrow. It starts today and here. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. I cannot, get away from temptation, Mohammed, to try to focus you a little bit, because everyone knows that you got Nobel Peace Prize, but for peace. I met so many people who were telling me that you should get Nobel Peace Prize for economy as well. Because what you were doing actually with your microcredit concept and getting out of poverty, so many empowered people also has its economy. So I would like you to try to connect those first two chapters, sustainable development and peace and security. Not getting out of this box because you want to paint a little bit broader as well. So please, Mohammed.
Well, thank you so much. Let's see. I just wanted to share my personal experience taking advantage of the theme that you proposed. It reminded me in a kind of flashback what happened to me and to the world. The topic that you suggested, fixing the fractured world, or fractured governance. And I'm in the habit of not fixing anything. I see fixing as a wrong move. It's a right thing is to abandon because it doesn't work. Why fix it? Build a new one, because all the accumulated things that we experience over years, still you want to keep the machine running by fixing it. Doesn't help us. We have come a long way. So this machine was built long back. By fixing it, we are kind of curtailing our strength and our ability and so on. So I always try to avoid fixing, and particularly I emphasize by saying world is in a self-destructive path. It will destroy itself, the way we have organized things for ourselves. If it is a self-destructive system on which you're working, fixing is dangerous. We're giving it a new life to that machine, which is destroying us. Continue on the path of destruction. If you are continuing on the old path with the old machine, you end up with the old destination. So most important part for us is to define a new destination, where we want to go, not fix the thing, where we want to go. That's what you are explaining. Once we agree in general that this is the one that we want to build, then we design a machine to get there. Old machine will not get us there. Old road will always take you to the old destination. If you want to go to a new destination, we have to build new roads. We have no option from that. So that's the point I want to make, that fixing is not a good strategy. Strategy is design, imagine the world that we want to build. It's an imagination. It's not about really happening. We let our imagination go wild and create the world that we want. Then we decide how do we get there. Then all the things will come. Not fixing the old machine will not take us there. This is number one. Then I wanted to share my personal experience of COVID-19. And you're all familiar with it because we are on it. Particularly I see my friend Tedros is sitting here. And part of the story is about him. When this began, the world is in chaos, don't know how to handle that. Who is going to handle it? It's an attack on the whole world. So naturally, we thought we will have a global response. We didn't. We talk about globalization. For the first time, we realized very clearly there is no globalization. We were isolated islands. Everybody's taking care of themselves. Cities taking care of the city folks. Villages are taking care of the village folks. Countries taking care of the country folks. Nobody's looking at the bigger picture. We are under attack. The whole world is under attack. Who is our general to fight? Tedros was saying something. People are listening to him. But there are big powers to undercut him. This is exactly the time when we have to have the big mobilization of the global power to fight this one big enemy that we have, where we drain funds from WHO. We hate WHO. We withdraw our representation in the WHO. This is exactly the same time. So instead of globalization, instead of seeing us as the world as a whole fighting a common enemy, we fell apart completely. So how do we discover ourselves that we as an entity, as a human being, as a community, we fight a common enemy with a common strategy under a common leadership? This is the leader who, the only institution we had is the WHO. Nobody else was involved in it. But WHO, we put them in sheds so that they cannot function. So this is our starting point when we did that. By the time 2020, middle of it, we are having a big campaign all over the world to restart the engine because the engine got stuck. The economy is getting stuck. The economy is not functioning anymore. All the governments of the world devoted themselves to restart the engine, whatever little engine they are left. And in order to do that, they are promising, they are announcing bailout packages. Some countries gave millions of dollars of bailout packages. Some gave billions of dollars of packages. Some trillions of dollars of bailout packages so that machine can start again, economy can start all over again. And this is the time I thought I should scream. And I started writing op-eds in different newspapers. And the heading was, "No going back." We don't want to go back to the economy which is stopped. This is a good time to redesign a new machine, new economic system, so that we can move up. And the common things we felt that the old system didn't serve us. So since the machine has stopped, we can always work on it. When we restart it, it will not be the old engine, it will be a new engine. Who cares? Everybody is busy to restart the old engine. And I felt very frustrated. We got only one chance. COVID-19, all the disaster it created, gave us one chance to rediscover ourselves and redesign things in a completely new way. When we come out of it, we come out of a new system. It didn't happen. Then we have started talking about vaccines, if you remember, in the middle and the late middle of it. Vaccine is coming, promises were there at the end of the year, vaccines will be available. Then we raised another voice. And we mobilized voices after voices around the world saying that this vaccine should be patent-free. Nobody should have an intellectual property right on this vaccine. And we had so many support from so many people around the world. We campaigned for it, people joined us, we raised it at the WTO. We got responses from WTO, but not enough to have a consensus. So we're coming, and people say, wow, how can your business work if you have no kind of patent right? We gave examples of polio vaccine. Said this polio vaccine, the inventor himself said, we don't want any patent right on it. It worked. The world is proud of it because finally we could handle polio because of this starting point. Why can't we do this? Because we have to save the world. Nobody listened. Finally, when the final count, I think 10 countries we didn't vote for patent right withdrawal. Everybody else did. But still, we didn't get the consensus to patent right remains. What happened because of the patent right? Vaccines were produced. Big companies produced big number of vaccines. Went where? Went to the rich countries. 80% of the vaccines produced went to the 10 rich countries. We were saying there's enough capacity in the world, everywhere, to produce vaccines locally, if only you remove the patent right. See, we started presenting the case, it is a life versus profit. In this whole struggle, profit won, life was defeated. Because the companies who have the patent right, they wanted to make big money, and they did. And all the vaccines went to the rich country, didn't go to the poor country. So again, we had a kind of situation where we could not address as a human being. We addressed as a kind of profit makers here and profit makers there. Ever since I'm saying the entire pharmaceutical company, all the idea of pharmaceutical company should be addressed in a different way. Create them as social business, which we promote. Social business is a business to solve people's problem, not to make money for any shareholder or anybody else. Only then healthcare will be available to people. As long as it is in the hands of the profit maximizers, healthcare will remain away, like the way it did COVID-19 vaccine. So this is how this entire thing continued to pass on one after another, that we are making ourselves proud as a global human community, saying that yes, we can work together with all the institutions that we built. Actually, when crisis came, we didn't. We became isolated communities, scared. What happens to us? Nobody's here paying attention to us. So when we go back to the fixing, I said fixing is not a solution. Fixing is a destruction. It's the same thing about the continuation. If you want to survive as a human being with the sharing and caring, only way out is to readdress the whole issue, how we create the economic system in a completely different way, not as a fixing procedure, but as a redesigning procedure. Then, only then we create the world which will not be self-destructive, which will be self-generating and continue to go to a higher and higher level of existence on this planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Madam Ruvendrini, she's coming from High Commissioner for Refugees as assistant of our dear friend Felipe Grandi, who did a great job as his predecessor, Antonio Guterres, who did a great job. So obviously that is the pathway to see where it is. Anyway, so when we talk about the future, we cannot forget actually what is the role of High Commissioner for Refugees, especially having in mind that predictions are saying that by 2050 there will be 700 million more working population in the globe. And out of all 700 million, more than 800 million are coming from Africa. China and India are plus minus 180 million. One are plus 180, another was minus 180. So we hear young leaders from Africa, from China, from India. And Europe is the only one that is stagnating, significantly stagnating, together with China. North America and Latin America a little bit uphill, but not much. So could you give us a little bit that perspective of not refugees, but this demographic perspective of the future, how we can balance this, all these issues that Guy was actually putting in front of us so eloquently. So please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Since you asked me a question that's completely out of my comfort zone, I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear it and just go back to what I really do know something about, which is really humanitarian issues. But it's actually closely linked to the question you're asking, because essentially most of the world's refugees right now are from Africa, from the African continent. And that is a clear demonstration of the level of stability in that continent, and that is obviously not something that's going to be dispelled anytime soon. But let me just start off. Since you started with numbers, let me also start with some numbers. The co-chair of the NGIC this morning, in his opening address, he basically mentioned the statistic. He said there are 114 million forcibly displaced people in the world today. That's equivalent to the 11th largest, most populous country on the planet. And that shows you the dimension of the problem that we have right now. Last year, UNHCR responded to 43 new emergencies. That's one emergency every 8 days. We are the humanitarian, and there are 55 conflicts in the world today, both internal and external, and UNHCR is and not just UNHCR, the humanitarians are involved in practically every single one of them. And in fact, the High Commissioner, when he met with the Secretary General of NATO a couple of days ago, he said, you do realize that UNHCR is involved in more conflicts than NATO is right now. And this is really a strong indicator. Peace has broken down. Humanitarians are now the firefighters. We are applying band-aid solutions in all kinds of emerging crises. Basically, in the absence of peace, humanitarian action has become a substitute for peace. It has become a substitute for political action. It has now rapidly becoming a substitute for development assistance as well. And the other second disturbing thing, and this we have observed also in the discussions around the Pact of the Future, is on the humanitarian development peace nexus. We have always believed that this concept was sacrosanct, that everybody believed in it. Now we see a massive divide between the global south, which strongly believes in the right to development, regardless of conditions, and the global north, which equally strongly believes that any development assistance has to be conditioned on peace and security, and in some instances, on progress on human rights. We humanitarians don't actually believe that the nexus is sequential or linear. We believe that it is not peace first, humanitarian action second, and then development third. We believe it all happens together. And this is something we have been promoting in the humanitarian world. We call it emergency development. And we're doing it right now in eastern Chad. Chad is a country that has immense domestic challenges, but it has maintained a hugely generous open doors policy for all the Sudanese refugees that are flooding across its borders. They have several 100,000 refugees now from Sudanese refugees in Chad, adding to the almost 1 million refugees they already had prior to the current crisis in Chad. So what are the humanitarians doing? We are encouraging the World Bank, the international financial institutions, the regional financial institutions, and development actors to go in now to eastern Chad, where all the refugees are coming in, and to provide assistance there, to establish programs there to benefit both the host communities, but as well as the refugees, to stabilize the populations, and to already start looking at peace and solutions there. And we are doing the same thing in other countries, in fragile countries like Afghanistan. Again, it seems counterintuitive. You know, this is a country which is now been taken over by the Taliban, by the de facto authorities who control pretty much the entire country. Most donors do not want to provide funding to that country. But what we have done is to establish what we refer to as priority areas of return and reintegration. Again, I'm using we in the broadest sense. This is the humanitarians. And these are areas in the country from which most IDPs and refugees originate. And we are basically encouraging development actors to go and invest in these areas, not the entire country, but at least in these areas, so that refugees and IDPs will be then encouraged to return and find solutions to their situation. And we're doing the same thing in South Sudan right now. Again, this is a country with serious challenges, both in terms of its own population, but also in terms of an influx of Sudanese refugees coming in. But we basically have established these pockets of hope along the lines of what we're doing in Afghanistan as well. So this is to show that it seems to be the humanitarians who are providing the solutions now in the absence of any other actors coming forward and taking these roles. The other thing I want to say is, despite all of the apathy and the controversy around the reform of the Security Council, the reform of the General Assembly, and all the political organs of the UN, the United Nations within itself has been quietly reforming itself since 2016. And we have the resident coordinator of Azerbaijan seated with us here today, and she will tell you that the reinvigorated, the strengthened resident coordinator system, the strengthened different ways of working within the United Nations country team, the funding compacts, and all of that have brought the different pillars of the UN itself, the peace and security pillar, the humanitarian pillar, and the development pillar within the UN system, not the member states, much closer together in terms of working together. It's far from perfect, but at least we're getting there, and we have been reforming ourselves. The second issue I wanted to raise is essentially, and these are some of the questions that were asked here, about preserving the international agreements that are fast unraveling. They have given two examples here, one on nuclear non-proliferation and environmental protection. But I would argue that the human rights and humanitarian law treaties are even more in danger of being unraveled right now. Again, listening to the discussions around the Pact for the Future, we are hugely dismayed, we humanitarians, to see to what extent international humanitarian law is being questioned right now. And this is in direct relation to what's happening in the Middle East and what was, of course, happening in Ukraine as well. Basically, how international humanitarian law is being applied, to whom it is being applied, and where it is being applied are all being brought into question. And that is hugely disturbing. I never honestly thought I'd see that in my lifetime. The other thing is, the world, right, this year is going, at least 79 countries have either had elections, are about to have elections, or in the process of having elections right now. And invariably what happens when it comes to electoral periods is that refugees and migrants become a scapegoat. Oh, look at all these foreigners coming in leaky boats, taking over our jobs, raping our women folk, threatening our children, being responsible for all the criminal acts that are happening in the country. This is a kind of, racism, xenophobia, and scapegoating and instrumentalizing refugees and migrants is almost a given in any electoral period, and that is hugely disturbing for us. And here's the kicker. 70% of the world's refugees are actually not taken to leaky boats or undertaking hazardous journeys to go to the global north. They are all in the global south. 70% of the world's refugees literally just cross the border and take refuge in the country neighboring theirs. 76% of refugees are in low-income and middle-income countries. The only industrialized country amongst the top 5 refugee-hosting countries is Germany. The other refugee-hosting countries, the top ones, Iran, Pakistan, Colombia, Uganda, and Turkey. So I'm just dispelling some of the myths that you see propagated in social media, in all the traditional forms of media as well. And the reason why I'm raising this is that this has provided a perfect platform for politicians to say, oh, all of these international human rights and humanitarian law treaties are completely obsolete. They were drafted in the 1940s, they were drafted in the 1950s, they do not fit the current reality today. My informed opinion, that's absolute rubbish. These instruments have saved millions of lives in the past, they will continue to save millions of lives in the future, and they have to be preserved at all costs. It is how the member states respect these conventions that is brought into question, not the conventions and the provisions themselves. And that is something that we do need to keep reminding member states constantly. One critical example of this, the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted by the General Assembly in 2018, along with the Global Compact on Orderly Migration as well. This is a compact which does not revisit the provisions of the international refugee treaties that were drafted in the 50s and 60s, but it adds to it. It basically says it recognizes the burden being borne by middle-income and low-income countries for protracted periods of time. Before coming to my present functions, I served as a head of operation in Pakistan. Pakistan has been hosting almost 2 million Afghan refugees for over 40 years now, with no solution in sight. Bangladesh has been hosting 1 million Rohingya refugees, again with absolutely no solution in sight. These countries deserve recognition for what they're doing, if nothing else. And the compact recognizes that. But going beyond recognizing the immense sacrifice in many cases of the refugee hosting countries, it's actually providing concrete ways of helping them as well through its main vehicle, which is a Global Refugee Forum that happens once every 4 years. And the difference with the Global Refugee Forum is essentially what we would like to see as a new form of multilateralism. It's a whole of society approach. It is not just member states, it's the NGOs, it's the private sector, it's the refugees themselves, it's religious groups, it's civil society. They all come together, they make concrete pledges every 4 years, and those pledges have to be implemented by the time the second forum comes around. They're concrete, they're measurable, and they're multi-stakeholder. So you have NGOs getting together with the private sector, getting together with academics, getting together with governments to commit to specific pledges in different areas, whether it's socioeconomic inclusion, education, legal protection, financial commitments, training, capacity building, you name it, it's all in there. And the success of this is that it focuses on concrete actions, it focuses on unity of purpose, and it focuses on facts and accountability. And believe me, if the humanitarian community and member states and all the other different stakeholders can gather around and unify around a theme like refugees, I think it can do that everywhere else as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Csaba, I introduced you 3 times, so please.
Thank you, Zlatko. Maria Fernanda put us a question. We want a better UN. And let me enlarge this wish with what I heard from you since this morning. We want a better UN with a better crisis management institutional architecture. That is in the core of the Summit of the Future. But my response immediately, before you would say that I start UN bashing here, it's my own background actually, but the UN is as much equipped to manage crises as its members want to do it. Not more, not less. Some of the shortcomings, nevertheless, which is in the crisis management capabilities of our institutions, including the UN, deserve some deeper attention. First and foremost, as you heard our discussion since this morning, the bulk of our discussion, when we talk about crisis, we mean traditional peace and security type of crisis with armed conflicts in the focus, which is right. That's what we hear from the headline news. That's what we see in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Sahel, different parts of Sahel, or Yemen, or the Red Sea, or somewhere else. But there are 2 buts. First, while we are mostly focusing it, not exclusively, mostly focusing it, including our institutional capabilities, the number of armed conflicts and complexity and duration of armed conflicts is on the rise. Now we are at the level of 52 armed conflicts going on as we speak, and in the last 5 years there was a 50% increase in this number. So something is wrong. The second is, in no case I would like to diminish the gravity of the armed conflict situation and the crises related to the wars, but we are losing many lives and much more material damage caused to us due to the non-armed conflicts, so non-traditional crisis situations. And the crisis management of today and tomorrow is different from the crisis management of yesterday. We have to notice that the traditional geopolitically driven crises and the crises related to the non-sustainable way of our operations started interacting, started creating a new reality. So only a more integrated, more equipped crisis management institution capability can help us. So in terms of structural needs, if we talk about the Summit of the Future, our future UN, future institutional setup, our capabilities are pretty much determined by the reforms coming from the post-World War II experience, from the post-decolonization experience and the post-Cold War era. But it's all in the past. We pay very little attention, institutionally at least, to the challenges that are coming up or that are looming on the horizon. What do I mean? We have much less UN capabilities to deal with the unchecked artificial intelligence development. I know there is a good advisory board working with the Secretary General, but the problem is that the AI development is going ahead at least 5 times faster than our reactions to regulate it. the water crisis. We are not equipped well in the UN to deal with the water crisis, despite the fact that it is causing 90% of the damage and almost 90% of the lives lost in the world. We have very little preparedness to face the collapse of societies due to depletion of national resources and the social impact of sovereign debt crisis. We talk about it, but we don't do about it, and we have no institutional capabilities for that. One more lesson from that. When we try to focus on the more traditional, geopolitically dominated crises, as it was described this morning, the zero-sum game mentality is dominating our approach. When we have to fix something that went wrong with the global common goods, it is because of our actions. It can only be done based on our cooperation. And what happens when we transfer the zero-sum game mentality coming from the geopolitical competition to the crisis management of the global common goods? It's not a zero-sum game too. It's a negative-sum game. And that is part of reality today, and we need to fix it in the reform attempt of our institutional structure. Very quickly only on Security Council reform, what we said today. It has been said already which are the areas of the Security Council negotiations. If I need to single out one single most important part of the Security Council reform, which is causing that Security Council is not a beacon of the peace and security anymore, but part of the problem, is the unlimited veto rights of the P5. There are many other, four other areas, but if we do not work around it, we will not change the situation in the Security Council. Enlarging the numbers, very, very important, but the enlarged Security Council can still behave the same way as the current Security Council. And by the way, 15 years already, we have been in the process of the so-called IGN, intergovernmental negotiations, on the reform of the Security Council. 15 years. And you know what was the result so far. I'm afraid that some member states may lose faith and start something else. On the General Assembly, my own background, we are lacking strategic planning in the General Assembly. If a pivotal part of this organization is having 200 plus priorities for a year, it means in crisis time we have no priority. It's a very, very dangerous situation. The second, what we need to think about when we want to reform this organization, there are way too many symbolic, single-use, little impact resolutions. 80% of our discussions are about the past. Do we want to win the past? It might be very useful because it can teach us lessons, but there are much more and much faster challenges ahead of us, and we don't really spend time on that. Not enough, at least. And our discussions in the General Assembly, even those which are not necessarily about the traditional geopolitical issues, are dominated by the geopolitical mentality and the zero-sum game. If we cannot separate at least the most dangerous non-geopolitical type of crises, what we want to handle, which require cooperation, and we keep them together with the traditional geopolitical type of crises, we will not make an inch forward. Last but not least, on some methodological changes. Our budgeting in the United Nations is still reflecting the past. Our discussions, mostly rooted in the past, and the response and planning capabilities are mostly largely fractured and looking backwards. Last but not least, in crisis time, when we need to find integrated solutions for integrated challenges, the basics, what we need to do to put our decisions and consideration on scientific evidence. Do we have the scientific infrastructure in the GA and in the United Nations to prepare decisions? We started, but we are not there yet. Thank you, Zlatko.
Thank you, Csaba. We haven't run out of time. We were just late by starting. So I just want to say that we have two more extraordinary speakers. I mean, two persons who were champions of multilateralism and known as a multilateral champion from their positions of leading the countries that were known as a country promoting itself multilateralism, and that's Calmy-Rey, who was, among other things, president of Switzerland, and of course, Olaf Ragnar Grimsson, president of Iceland. So they're coming from two countries who we think that you don't care about the future because future is safe for you. You proved that the future in Switzerland and future in Iceland is right. And we are used on it. We have that prejudice. We would like to have your opinion on how we can continue together to have a bright future.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to confess I would like to live in a world without war, without hate, in a world where states can coexist harmoniously, in a world where people are not bombed, killed, injured, where human rights are respected, where gender equality is there. I would like in such a world, and my question is, why is that not possible in the 21st century? Why, on paper, the organization of global governance seems to be rational? On paper, because you have the UN General Assembly, represents the legislative power, you have the International Court of Justice, which deals with disputes between states, the judicial power, and you have the Security Council, the executive power, whose task is to intervene in the event of violations of a conflict, of a threats of peace. On paper, but at the end, everything depends on the great powers and their willingness to submit to international rules and often to their own rules. The world community of states has detailed rules of conduct. The United Nations Charter defines precisely when the use of armed force is legal, in self-defense or when authorized by the Security Council. The Geneva Conventions define what is permitted and prohibited in the use of force in armed conflict. These are standards on almost every subject. But these are too often double standards. The problem is the great powers do not feel bound by the rules of law. It is as if the responsibilities conferred on them by their military might or their economic and financial power were not in their own interest. That's why multilateralist common rules binding all countries is suffering. The world faces major challenges. We must decrease poverty, fight instability, inequalities, and climate change. But the multilateral institutions are not able to meet these current challenges. As example, the unacceptable paralysis of the Security Council in relation to ongoing conflicts. Against the backdrop of growing geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainties, the tendencies to turn inward and return to regional alliances outweighs the ability to find common understandings. And in this game, everyone loses. Take the example of the WTO. By blocking the functioning of the WTO's appeal body, which is indispensable to the settlement of various trade disputes, the United States has achieved the goal of disconnecting an essential tool of multilateralism and replacing it with the law of the strongest. The WTO knows difficulties, but these apply to other supranational institutions, to the WHO, to the SWIFT payment system, to the monopoly of the London Precious Metals Exchange, and so on and so on. All these organizations were founded after the World War II or gained influence during that period. And this period is coming to an end. Nations led by China and the BRICS and the so-called Global South are working on a new payment system, an alternative to the World Bank, and on many other subjects. The United States uses trade as a weapon against China and pursues an exclusive industrial policy. At the same time, China, along with other emerging economies, is building a parallel international system centered on its own institutions and partnerships. In this confrontation, the European Union has the most to lose, as its model was built on the rules of multilateralism, which have become inoperative with the weakening of the WTO. The tendency to turn inward and to return to regional alliances outweighs the ability to find common rules. The weakness of multilateralism is a risk factor for the world peace. And faced with these existential questions, the UN can no longer content itself with managing current affairs. We must admit that strengthening multilateralism, reforming the UN model, is crucial. Reform of the UN Security Council by taking on the admission of new and non-permanent members, especially from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, revival of the General Assembly, more equitable representation in decision-making to reflect the changing global economic landscape, and given more influence on emerging economies and new distributions of decision-making capacity. For example, the ability of global organizations to take decisions by a majority of the members and not by unanimity of its members. But only willing reform on a technical basis is not sufficient. The need for reform arose from the contestation of the world order that emerged from the Second World War. But we have to admit that some of the common rules established are no longer respected, perhaps because they are ill-adapted to our times, to our social, technical evolutions, not to say to our ideological evolutions. Take, for example, the Geneva Convention. Take, for example, the rules on the respect of human rights. The law of war is not respected, nor are the respect of human rights. Yet, the world is experiencing intense suffering, and it's a time like this when vulnerable people are murdered, taken hostage, wounded, killed, victim of indiscriminate bombing, of brutal warfare. It's at this time that we cannot remain indifferent. It's at this time that we need the law, not an abstract law, but a protective law. In legal terms, the most important rule is a prohibition of the use of force laid down in the United Nations Charter. But if a conflict does break out, the rules of international humanitarian law apply. The aim is to protect and limit the suffering caused by conflict. South Africa brought the Israeli-Palestinian case before the International Court of Justice, the UN's principal judicial body, asking it to look into possible acts of genocide. It claims that Israel's war in Gaza is in the nature of genocide. The court answered quickly on South Africa's request for conservative measure. That means an immediate stop of fighting in Gaza and stop of hate speeches. A major problem is that neither the International Court of Justice nor the Geneva Conventions do provide for sanctions or implementation measures in the event of violations of their rules or decisions. Should we therefore challenge some fundamental thinking about war, about existing rules? Today, debates about the conduct of war and violations of these rules are confronted with the desire to contextualize and that, to some extent, justify human rights violations. Shouldn't we reposition human rights and respect for them at the heart of the problem in order to ensure better protection of people? For example, shouldn't attacks on hospitals or schools be seen not as violations of the law of war, but rather as a question of violations of the right to health or education? I don't have the answers to these questions, but what I know surely is that wanting to reform our system of governance, giving it greater stability and ensuring its support also means giving a more central role to human rights, gender equality, when we address the issue of contemporary warfare. Thank you.
Mr. President, now the floor is yours. How do you say, the cherry on the top of the cream?
Well, thank you very much indeed. You have emphasized my previous position as President of Iceland, but perhaps I should speak more as somebody who has devoted almost the entirety of my public life to supporting the United Nations as an ideal, having more than 40 years ago attended my first meeting in the headquarters, but also following my colleague here, speaking with the frankness that we, the people of the mountains, get accustomed to. So in that spirit, if I may, let me start with two paradoxes that I have experienced here today. The first paradox is that whereas we are supposed to talk here about global governance and the Summit of the Future, the two key messages we got from Azerbaijan and Turkey at the opening session earlier today was how the president of our host country very eloquently, without a single paper in front of him, described the success of unilateral military action in solving the key problem of his country, and throwing in towards the end a sarcastic dressing down of one of the key leaders of the European Union, NATO, and a permanent member of the Security Council for its double standards towards the so-called liberal international order. And then following this very interesting opening speech about the advantages of unilateral military action in solving key national problems, the message from Turkey was the growing importance, perhaps exclusive dominance of regional cooperation as we move forward in the 21st century. And intellectually, these two fundamental messages in the opening session are contradictory to the subject of what we are supposed to be discussing in this panel. And I think they seriously pose an intellectual challenge to what is the prevailing ongoing assumption in the endless dialogue, which has now been taking place for more than 30 years, of the so-called reform of the United Nations, which so far has not produced anything, and increasingly reminds me of the endless discussions of the reform of the Catholic Church, which also hasn't really produced anything in the same time period. But let me also be very blunt on the second paradox. I find it astounding but not surprising that the person who is responsible for organizing the Summit of the Future has neither the time nor the interest to be present towards the end of our dialogue. That in itself is a message from the 38th floor of the United Nations, similar to what we have increasingly, those of us who have supported the United Nations have painfully in recent years observed, that the 38th floor seems to be more interested in pontificating than actually listening constructively to the dialogue among the people in the rest of the world. I know this is not supposed to be said in polite diplomatic society, where you simply don't remark on the leader of the Summit of the Future walking out on this discussion. But that is basically what he did. Because his responsibility is perhaps at the core of what we all face. The fundamental question whether the edifice which was constructed at the end of the Second World War is fit for the 21st century. I often put it differently. We need to make the intellectual case why a structure which in the 1940s was created by the Soviet Union, by America as the only nuclear power in the world, having recently dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, by Britain and France in the final decades of their colonial rule, and by a very different China from the China we have today. We have to make an intellectual case, if it can be made at all, why this structure created by these key players, which I have just described, is fit for a world where within 20 years, 3/4 of the global population will live in Asia and Africa, where the combined economic power of China and India soon will overshadow the role of Europe in the global economy. And when increasingly the Middle East, as key allies of the United States, are seeking alliances and cooperation with both Iran and China. So the first intellectual question at the Summit of the Future is, do we need an entirely new structure? Or is it indeed possible for us to repair this almost outdated edifice which was created by the Soviet Union and America, the colonial powers of Europe, and a very different China, will be our best structure as we move forward in the 21st century. And I think a very strong case can be made that it might be better and more productive to throw it all away and create a new model, an entirely new model, and have the intellectual power and the courage, like those who at Bretton Woods designed the institutions towards the end of the Second World War, to design the structures that are fit for the realities of the 21st century. In the previous panel here today, real politics was almost talked about as a dirty word. But real politics is something which we have to take account of, as was so brilliantly pointed out by the former foreign minister of Serbia, when he asked the question, why is it likely that a summit of the future taking place at the time when the television screen is every night full of the dying people in Gaza and also in Ukraine, and Trump is about to walk into the White House, having kicked his ambassador to the United Nations into political oblivion on his way. Because in politics, as we all know, timing is everything. And this might be the worst timing ever to bring the world together to really talk about meaningful reform of the United Nations. So I would say respectfully to those responsible for this summit, you have taken on your shoulders an extraordinary responsibility, because if you fail, if the outcome is almost a meaningless 200 pages of additional endless listing of all kinds of concerns and the world doesn't pay any attention to it, there will be years and decades until we have the energy to come together again to answer the fundamental question, what kind of structures do we need for the 21st century? But the good news is, and let me conclude with that, especially since this country is hosting COP29 towards the end of the year, the reason why COP28 in Dubai, hosted by the United Arab Emirates, was such a success, and it was a clear success compared to almost all the other COP meetings, definitely since the Paris meeting took place. The core reason is that they adopted a completely new model of how to bring the world together. That is perhaps in the long run what makes COP28 so interesting. That not only did it deliver on finance and loss and damage and energy transition and all the other things that it delivered on, but it demonstrated that you can almost from scratch, as they did in January of last year, build a global coalition of not just governments, but anyone who wanted to be helpful and interested, civil society, businesses, indigenous people, and all the others, and deliver the result because it was a truly new global coalition of everyone who had anything to contribute and anyone who wanted to be a member of this effort. It opened up in a democratic way this process, and it's kind of paradoxical that it was those almost feudalistic Arab countries in the Middle East that opened this democratic process up in this way. And that is why I think the COP29 here will be so interesting, because the fundamental question to this host country that's hosting us and will host the COP towards the end of the year is, will they evolve this new model of success globally, which COP28 clearly demonstrated, and thus giving all of us a new fundamental basis on which to meaningfully discuss a reform of the international structures of institutions and cooperation? Or will it go back to the more traditional intergovernmental operation, which unfortunately in previous years has not produced any result? So towards the end of this dialogue, let me simply say this. I think we need the courage and the intellectual strength to go back to basics, to really go back to the fundamental questions that global governance should be all about for the 21st century. And if we don't have the courage or the intellectual power to do so, we will end up like the Catholic Church, endlessly discussing its purpose and its operations. But of course we will, and the United Nations survive as an institution like the Catholic Church has survived, but it will increasingly be peripheral so far as the problems of the world are concerned. And it pains me towards the end of my life, seeing something I believed so strongly in as a young man being put into that position. Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank to all panelists. And of course I want to take responsibility for something. You know, it's very hard to talk about the future because more you talk about the future, more chances you have to miss it. I mean, not to miss the future, but to miss prediction in your prediction. Because you will not miss the future. Future will come, whatever we think about it, if we talk about it, if we don't talk about it. So the future will come. 20 years ago, the gentleman, my colleague, professor of economics, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for Economy 15 years ago, 3 years before that, he had a prediction that internet will do nothing to economy. And it will be having impact as much as fax machine. 3 years later, he got Nobel Peace Prize, not for that prediction, definitely. So you never know, I mean, when you do prediction, I mean, how the things will unfold. My favorite engineer, because I'm an engineer background, Thomas J. Watson, who I learned so much about, who actually was a legendary leader of IBM. He was also known, today the biggest research center in computer science has his name. And he predicted the future when he was on the top. And he said that probably, there will be a global market for about 3 to maybe 4 computers. He missed, obviously. My favorite is a gentleman who was in charge of patents back in between 2 centuries, more than 100 years ago, who said that he will close the patent bureau when he retires because everything that can be invented was already invented. He missed. We missed today because we planned that to be finished almost an hour earlier. So that's the reason why Ryder had to leave half hour being more than he was supposed to be in here, because we missed in our timing. Probably the guilt is not mine or yours, or it's mine if it's among us, but it's maybe of the previous panels who broke the timing. They were not that good in planning. Yes, Mr. President, you always have a floor.
Well, I admire your attempt to excuse him, but the rest of us also had other obligations, but we stayed because the matter was important.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Anyway, to make a long story short, I want to thank you all for that we were being here with us all day, even regardless of the previous obligations, like all of us said. I also want to say that what this is attempt, I do not agree with some of previous panelists, not from this panel, but previous panelists, who think that maybe it's a weird time to talk about the future. I think it's the right time to talk about future. I think there's no more important to talk about the future now in such a turbulent and unpredictable time, and maybe time that is very gloomy in front of us. And I think that's why it is so important that we talk about it strategically, that we think about the future and talk about the future and confront our views about the future. And smarter people more smarter people is in the room, more different futures they will envision in front of them. And we have to find a way to have a shared future, and that requires shared leadership, and it requires shared visioning, and that's what this exercise at the Global Baku Forum is about. And after all, Global Baku Forum is about dialogue, tolerance, learning and understanding. Last night I was chairing a very interesting panel. Believe me, that was one of the most interesting panels in my life. I mean, we were lucky that there were no dinner after our panel, so we could go on for 2.5 hours talking about Palestine and Israel with distinguished friends Tzipi Livni and Amr Musa. We didn't plan it. If we did it according to the book, we would finish in an hour and 15 minutes, but we stayed 2 times longer. And the biggest gain for me was that we talked and no one stood up and walked away in a situation where there's such a tense about what is happening, how innocent people are getting killed today in Gaza. And that's why I think we have to, and don't get me wrong, I will have only one person to close. And that is one of our young leaders. Let them close. Don't ask nothing. Or ask, but your question will be unanswered. And your word is the last word today about Summit of the Future. I see 2 of you. You can both, but only young leaders about whose future we are trying to talk. So, as a chair, no one from panel, including myself, is going to say anything after you do. You have the floor. You
and your future is what we are talking about. So you better say the last word today, please.
Thank you so much, panelists, for such, I would say, controversial to some extent, the discussion. My name is Adriana. I'm the young leader from Latvia, and I work in educational sector. And my question is, and actually the comment on what I have heard, to be honest, I see the future of international organizations really challenging, because the decisions, the solutions, the guidelines which the international institutions provide, they have the recommendational matter. And some of the states are ignoring throughout the years the guidelines which were provided by people from different countries. So my question and comment is the following. What steps, what processes have to be transformed in order to come from the theoretical part to practical part, and guaranteeing that the basic values and basic human rights, including the education, are guaranteed and provided in the states? Thank you.
Thank you. No one is going to answer. These gentlemen in here, ladies, they're all available for you from now on, because you are 3 days in here more. And if someone of them wants to answer your question, they're welcome to come to your group and talk to you about your future. Thank you very much.